We were in Cape Breton for the last few days. And one of the things down there is that there are so many churches that are closed or have been converted into homes or art centers. You sort of wonder why. Where have all the congregants gone? In the first few chapters of the book of Acts, churches were not being closed. The church was on fire. And in the first 4 chapters, Peter gave 3 sermons. And the theme of each of them was primarily this. Acts 2, verse 22. Whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pangs of death. Acts 3:15, whom God raised up from the dead, of which we are witnesses. Acts 4:10, whom you crucified, when you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. The theme was primarily one of the resurrection and of God's ascension. Very little was made actually of the crucifixion. And it said because of this, because people looked to this, Acts 4:32, and the multitude was of one heart and one soul. And in Acts 4:33, great grace was upon them all. You know, the apostles became on fire after they saw the risen Christ and after they were baptized. They were bold. A few weeks before this event, Peter had denied Christ 3 times. And it says in the book of John that after the crucifixion, they all huddled together in the room for fear of the Jews. And now, just a few weeks later, Peter is preaching to the Jews. He's preaching to the multitudes in the temple, and he's criticizing and holding the Sanhedrin up for what they did. This is a dramatic change. It wasn't the crucifixion that gave the disciples boldness. In fact, they cowered after the crucifixion. They ran away. It wasn't Jesus' blood and his death that gave them the courage. We sing about the blood. We sing about the crucifixion. But actually, this is not the important part. It has importance, definitely. But as Paul said in 1 Corinthians, if Christ is not risen, then you are still in your sins. In other words, without the resurrection, there is no forgiveness of sin. But the churches today primarily focus on the crucifixion and the blood. Nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we sometimes neglect the next part and don't give it the credence that it should have. If you go back to the book of Exodus, the type of this was the crucifixion of the perfect lamb with the blood on the doorposts and the lintel to cover the Hebrews. And it did. It covered them and freed them from the bounds of slavery of Egypt. But once they got out into the desert, they lost their faith. They criticized. Every time something went wrong, they either wanted to go back to Egypt or they criticized God, to the point that he got exasperated with them, and on more than one occasion told Moses that he was going to be punishing them. Moses held him off until they came to the promised land. And then Moses, disbelieving God, sent spies into the promised land to scout it out. Them coming back and only 2 of the spies saying, we can go in there. The rest saying, the enemy's too powerful. As a result, God took the promised land away from most of them. He said, doubtless, in Numbers 14, doubtless you shall not come into the land which I swore to make you dwell, except for Caleb and for Joshua. But your little ones, which you said would be a prey if we went in there, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. He's accusing the Hebrews of despising the promises that God had made to them. And he goes on to say, as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, so that no one over the age of 20 would survive to enter the promised land. These people were all covered by the blood. In Hebrews, he refers to this. He refers to it as his rest.
Yes.
It says, Hebrews 3:8, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years, whereof I was grieved with that generation, and said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. The Old Testament sort of is one which shows the wrath of God, where the New Testament shows the love of God. But the idea is that these Hebrew people were covered by the blood. But because of hypocrisy, because they said they believed, but actually didn't, they never entered the promised land. In the same case, we're covered by the blood of Christ. But it's not the blood that's really the importance. It's the belief in the living Christ, in the resurrected Christ, in the coming again Christ. That's really important.
Praise God.
And perhaps this is something the church doesn't emphasize enough. Because we spend our time, a lot of it, in the past, on the crucifixion and on the blood. Important, but not enough on the more important resurrection and second coming. We do communion, and we often do it to commemorate the death of Christ. But it doesn't say that in the Bible. It says, do it in remembrance of me. Not in remembrance of my death, but in remembrance of the living me. So, yes, the blood is important. But it's the focus on the resurrection and on the living God, which is the most important.
Amen.
And that is something we should all think about.
Amen.